Good evening. If we're in a situation where, as I understand, we are pending what could be any number of descriptions of a sort of transition in terms of understanding a particular leadership paradigm, which also could involve a change to what we have previously known as our administration and functioning of our administration, then I think there's some things that need to be discussed candidly and need to be put into the realm of acknowledgement officially. The first thing has to do with the base of the people within the state of Texas and the context for understanding their material stability based upon their actual ownership of property and their investment potential. Now, if you understand it from a perspective of private property rights in accordance with a particular understanding of American history, there's one way to go on. If you're talking about an understanding that investment in actual means of production then stimulates and encourages an interest in the decision making and the affairs of the actual capacity, and hence then reinforces a expectation of accountability even on the most basic level, then you still have to factor in certain realities as they exist. Since I've been in Texas since 2016, I have seen repeatedly a process whereby Texas, but not exclusively Texas, right, gets to a point right before the maturation on a long term process comes to bear, and then some catastrophe that presumably was unanticipated ends up occurring in order to impact the yield. Sometimes these can have impacts on things that have a very long term. Within 25 years is a particular term, but within 100 years is another. And what I've seen is a cyclical process of engineering a form of catastrophe or engineering a form of crisis right before the yield comes due, with the understanding that it will either compel a allegedly emergency recapitulation so that you accept less than what you were expecting, or you roll it over into a new obligation. But the problem is, you invested at the time with an expectation and understanding that you were going to get one thing as part of the investment. And so the yield would have reflected your investment and your participation over that time frame, as opposed to getting to the time right when the yield was coming due and then hearing and understanding, well, you're not going to get that. But you can take what is acknowledged as having been contributed already and roll it over into a completely new deal that I anticipate and know from personal experience I would never have agreed to invest in at the beginning. And so what I personally have been experiencing may be comparable to what other people have been experiencing in this paradigm, which is I never would have agreed to that. I agreed to something else. I did something else, but you didn't want to acknowledge the full impact of what it meant to get me and my skills and my assets involved. And you didn't want to compensate it, and you certainly did not want to have to adhere to legally required policies, procedures, and laws in order for us to have the maximum yield possible. And so what you call a catastrophe or what you call a crisis is no such thing. It's a default. And you're trying to convince me that this intentionally orchestrated default is not actually about a bad faith intent up front. And a bad faith intent up front that risked from the onset assets that, had it been understood or known what your actual desired end goal was, would never have even been on the table. And the understanding was they were put on the table in a completely false paradigm with an understanding that when the yield comes due, you can pull them out and you already know the character and comportment of that whom you were originally investing with would not tolerate treating it, using it, or disposing of it in the manner you seem more than willing and ready to do yourself. And that's where we are right now. I'm looking around on the internet in terms of the things that, from a variety of perspectives, very quickly, one would look at in terms of talking about, for instance, this proposed infrastructure investment paradigm. Now, Attorney General of Texas, already know that for many years there were a number of countries internationally that had decided to take a certain percentage of their annual production and put it into an account for a global development bank. More than 5 years ago, there was a commitment from at least 5 countries to take a certain percentage of their actual national income and put it in a bank together, an account together, and allow it to be maintained in that account for a while they made decisions about what their investment priorities were going to be globally. Now, there are those that would say that this arrangement was contrary to what the United States was working on. This is also in connection with an understanding that there were disagreements about things on the level of the World Bank in terms of development and infrastructure development and the kinds of modalities and paradigms that were being proposed by these other countries, almost as if there was a disparation in terms of not only priorities, but also praxis in terms of implementation of priorities. Regardless of that, during that time frame, it was understood they were going to be trying to make assessments about what they would have considered to be appropriate investment in development projects around the world, including infrastructure. This consortium did not at the time overtly or directly involve the United States. But ever since the 2016 presidential campaign, there has been a very specific project identified with an infrastructure development bank from within the United States that I contend was part of the continued outlay process that was engaged as part of the Affordable Care Act, which itself was a part of the outlay process engaged as part of the 2008 banking bailout. And because there has been no actual disclosure about the connections of those processes, now when we get to this point where we're trying to talk about infrastructure, we've had at least 5 years of intentional disinvestment in what would be the material primary incubator sectors that would be necessary for actual infrastructure investment. This is also in the course of billions, if not trillions, of dollars worth of obligation in the form of municipal or general obligation bonds for municipalities and regions all over the country, many of which are either for the administrative functioning of the municipality, which also includes its public works sector, or for specific infrastructure projects within those areas. But when it comes to accountability, and when it comes to reconciliation, and when it comes to appropriate appraisal of these public works in order to determine their actual role in the legitimate public financing regime, where is that? See, if we were serious about the kind of infrastructure that purportedly was even talked about in the 2016 campaign season, we would have had a process of massive appraisals going on with existing public works. We would have had inventories of what was going on in the major municipalities and how they may or may not be regionally compatible with more outlaying areas and infrastructure investment therein based upon appraisals of what already existed. That would have included workers' compensation issues, workers' benefit issues, workers' safety issues, but it also would have primarily focused on both education and practical implementation of strategies around using fixed assets in communities when it came to financing and allowing for people to understand both the responsibilities but the opportunities associated with them. That would have meant, at the very least, we would have already dealt with Flint, Michigan, rather than postponing it and saying we needed another 10 years, for instance. And not only that, we also have to deal with the fact that in the course of this, we already had appropriated through both the federal budget process as well as state budgets, or rather, the state budgets that had processes for implementation of federal appropriations concerning certain kinds of job development and training that should already have been accomplished by now that were completely defaulted. For instance, when it comes to pipeline management and safety administration appropriation, specifically for pipe inspectors for the gas and oil sector. Where are those jobs? Those jobs have been appropriated for 10 years. By 2017, there were supposed to have already been trained a certain number of new pipeline inspectors so that they could provide a transition for both technical expertise, but also other things that had already been appropriated for concerning an energy transition in this country. Where are those pipeline inspectors? You're talking right here to somebody that went through the process in Texas to get that very job. Where am I now? Where are the people I went to class with? How many of the people that were training to get certification and practical job experience in actual pipeline safety management and or inspection ended up getting diverted into something that is not about actual pipeline safety? Anything else, including crypto finance and including medtech, right? Those were not the jobs that were appropriated for. Those were not the jobs and the specific skill sets that needed to be transferred as part of technical training and recertification processes that brought in a new generation of people and, by the way, new demographics of people. Not talking about a pre-program understanding of fitting a particular quota in terms of information put into a pension scheme. People that had an actual practical experience in different environments, in different groups of people, that had a different human capital coming into the job. So when they got the actual literal expertise and training, they could apply it and have a form of discernment that then could create a value-added contribution to the community they were engaging. None of this has happened. Nothing like that has happened in Texas. Instead, we have had at least 4 so-called natural disaster emergency scenarios that have attempted to draw down on emergency assistance from the federal government while it is completely mismanaged locally, and there has been no actual yield of material gains of actual employment of people, increasing compensation that is actually commensurate with the skills or needs, management of existing fixed assets while also assessing the need for implementation of strategies concerning new fixed assets, or delivery on outlays that should have been happening concurrent to community-based processes regarding policy development in key areas, as in the Northern Texas Water District, and what was last year supposed to be a period of public discussion regarding rates associated with water access concurrent to an outlay for new pipeline construction, as well as existing pipeline maintenance that was supposed to go into effect, but because of COVID-19. And instead, billions of dollars. And if you, just in the state of Texas, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of bonded obligations specific to water management and wastewater management in Texas for the year 2019 that was supposed to start being implemented in 2020, that was intentionally and willfully impacted by what ended up happening instead with COVID-19. And then when the bonds started coming out and presumably the financing started coming out for projects connected to what was outlaid or what was intended for 2020, well, what was the characterization? I'll tell you what the characterization was. An intentional, willful refusal to be fiscally accountable so that now somebody can try to make a false justification for recapitalization. No. You do not get to contrive and intentionally conspire to make a false justification for forced collectivizing all the skills, assets, and energy of the people of the state of Texas or the United States of America, making 3 major stock issues on it that were completely misrepresented, including in ways connected to offloading assets from the United States to other countries with totally fraudulent characterizations aimed at sabotaging their economies, and then tell us, well, now we're going to go through a process and obligate even more trillions of dollars to infrastructure development. You do not have the material preconditions for a legitimate, sound infrastructure development paradigm, period.
And you're not going to until you start prosecuting people that sabotage the polity and the economy and already positioned themselves to illegally and illicitly benefit from a contrived bid rigging scheme where they've already parcelized everything and already claimed what they wanted. And what they want to see is who performs where when it comes to pinging them in order to pay off debts that should not have even been assessed as such. Do you understand? Do you want to get into the Democrat versus Republican? Well, if you had done your job and actually exposed how right now this country is in a very dangerous situation because you allowed for a default on the terrorism risk insurance program, we might be in a better position to actually deal with what they are trying to float in its stead. Let me tell you quite bluntly, G7, if you got so into a completely fraudulent, illegal, and unconscionable global hedging strategy that you have to put the good faith and character of your entire country behind a completely bogus tax scam, I cannot say that I have much pity for you. You guys already knew, and it is not appropriate for you to think that every other country on the planet is supposed to be able to be exploited to cover up for how you bought into a bad hedging strategy that you lost. You guys lost. You guys lost, and you continue to lose every single day. You conspire to cover up for what you lost. It is not my responsibility. It's not the responsibility of my people, and it's not the responsibility of people in other countries to cover up for the fact that you hedged wrong and you lost. You lost, and you lost big. And you need to be honest about that instead of coming up with this contrivance of capping liability at 15% for the 100 most favorite corporate entities status. I don't think so. Even if you have succeeded in your majoritary depopulation agenda, you still haven't killed enough of us. Unfortunately, we do not have the material preconditions for an actual, literal, safe infrastructure development paradigm. And you already know we're not going to until we have the coverage we need to do it safely. And that means removing people that are blatantly unsafe from alleged political operationalization under the cover of sovereign immunity and everybody conspiring to finance them with stuff they stole from us. Until you do that, it is not safe to continue to try to contrive and psychologically manipulate people around an infrastructure paradigm. Even if you start talking about how you're going to get cruel with taxes, you're taxing the wrong people.